Hello everyone and welcome back to the Dungeon Learner's Guide. Today we are going to be walking through another Commander's Guild deck. This is our 11th one, and it's called Call an Ambulance, but not for me. And if the name doesn't tell you what we're doing, trust me, it'll make sense in just a minute. But we are, as we do in all of our videos, going to scryfall.com, randomly selecting a card, working with a budget of $100 or less, and building a commander deck for Magic the Gathering all around a theme of our chosen card. So for this week, our random card was a little bit interesting, and it is Pause for Reflection, a 3-mana instant speed convoke, so we can tap our creatures to help pay for a mana for this card, and it prevents all combat damage that would be dealt this turn. So a little bit of a weird card. And originally, when I started building this deck, I was thinking, something like a turbo fog deck, being able to play a bunch of fog spells to prevent us from taking any damage, being able to kind of stall out the game, maybe be a little bit controlling. And then I started looking for commanders. And one card really stuck out to me, and we kind of warped the rest of the deck around it. So our commander is actually going to be a pretty new card. It is Questing Beast. So this is a 4-mana, 4/4 legendary creature beast with vigilance, death touch, and haste. Can't be blocked by creatures with power 2 or less. Combat damage that would be dealt to creatures you control can't be prevented. And whenever it deals combat damage to an opponent, it deals that much damage to target planeswalker that player controls. So, a bit of a mouthful, but the important part here is that third line of text. Combat damage that would be dealt by creatures we control can't be prevented. So if we cast our Pause for Reflection and we prevent all combat damage, that turns into a one-sided effect, because our creatures can still deal damage and our opponent's creatures can't. So if we swing into a massive board of our opponent's creatures, they block expecting to kill a bunch of our stuff and some of their stuff dies, we can just make sure that our team is the only side doing damage. And that's the main goal of what we're trying to do here. Now, to go along with that though, we have a couple of themes tied into this deck. The first one, obviously, like we mentioned, are fog effects, being able to prevent all combat damage that would be dealt this turn. I tried to focus very heavily on cards that prevent damage specifically to players, because preventing it to creatures isn't too big of a deal for us. We want to try to prevent the damage that would be dealt in general, not just ones that say, dealing the damage to creatures or dealing the damage to players. We want something that hits everything. And so we tried to stick to pretty cheap fogs, but we do have almost every one in green that we could possibly have. Budget restricting, of course. Our next theme is going to be power 4 or greater, I guess. So there's a lot of cards. It's like the ferocious mechanic that it cares about power 4 or greater. So Garruk's Uprising is a good example of that. When Garruk's Uprising enters the battlefield, if we control a creature with power 4 or greater, we draw a card, and whenever a creature power 4 or greater enters, we draw a card. Our commander is a 4-mana, 4/4 creature. So all the cards that care about having a 4-power creature trigger specifically if we have our commander out. Now, Questing Beast isn't the only 4-power creature in the deck, but it is very accessible to us, so we kind of leaned into the ferocious theme a little bit. And our last major theme of the deck is just big, beefy creatures that probably don't have too much of a home somewhere else. Cards like Gigantosaurus, the 5-mana 10/10. Doesn't have trample on its own, but with cards like Garruk's Uprising, we can give it trample, and then with our fog effects and Questing Beast, we can make sure it's always able to deal damage without dying to anything in return. And there are other ways to make sure that it can push through damage or to give it trample, so just having a bunch of cheap, large creatures makes this deck very quick and very effective. However, if we had to go through this deck and we had to pick out 3 cards in particular that I would say are key cards, that are the most important cards in the deck, the first place we'd start would be with Toski. Toski, again, a pretty new card, Bearer of Secrets, can't be countered, is a 1/1 indestructible squirrel. It attacks each combat if able, but the most important line of text is whenever a creature we control deals combat damage to a player, draw a card. With Questing Beast, it can't be blocked with creature's power 2 or less, so that there's no chump blocking. If someone wants to block it, they can, but it has Death Touch. So there's always a good chance we're going to be able to draw at least one card every time we go to combat. And that's something that this deck really wants to lean into, is drawing a whole bunch of cards, being able to do a lot of extra damage, getting a lot of extra lands, putting a ton of creatures on the board. And we need to be able to recur a lot of our card draw to be able to do that. Our next key card is Constant Mists. Now, I mentioned we have a ton of fog effects. This one is probably one of the best. 2 mana, creatures deal no combat damage this turn, but it has buyback, sacrifice a land. So if we sacrifice a land, then we can get this card back into our hand. Since we're in a mono green deck, we have a ton of ways to get lands onto the board, so we have a ton of lands that we'll be able to sacrifice to Constant Mists, meaning we can keep fogging every turn if we need to be able to. And our last key card in here is going to be Rishkar's Expertise. Again, leaning into a bit of the card draw. But Rishkar's Expertise allows us to draw cards equal to the greatest power among creatures we control. And it allows us to cast a card with converted mana cost 5 or less from our hand without paying its mana cost. That part, while good, isn't the main draw here. The main draw here, well, for lack of a better term, please pardon the pun, is Rishkar's Expertise being able to draw us a ton of cards. If we have something like the Gigantosaurus, a 10/10, we just draw 10 cards for 6 mana, which is pretty good rate. And out of those 10 cards that we just drew, we get something for free. So maybe we just drop down a free Toski, we draw some more cards when we attack. That's the goal here. With all of that being combined, though, I was able to find a couple of cool interactions while I was building this, stuff I didn't quite expect. This first one is Bellowing Tangleworm and Keeper of Fables. Again, leaning into the card draw, trying to hit our opponents. But Bellowing Tangleworm gives green creatures Intimidate, so they can only be blocked by green creatures or artifact creatures. So if we have a Toski, we have a Keeper of Fables, that whenever we do damage to our opponents, we draw cards, we pretty much make our team unblockable if our opponents are in any color but green or have a ton of artifacts, which means we'll be drawing a bunch of cards, which will again probably help us get more creatures, and we just turn into a big rolling ball of creatures that can't be stopped. And our second pretty cool interaction is between Yorvo, Lord of Garenbrig, and Ant Queen. And now, on the surface, this doesn't look like much. Yorvo comes in with 4 counters, and whenever another green creature enters the battlefield, we put a +1/+1 counter on Yorvo. Ant Queen, we can pay 2 mana to make a 1/1 green insect creature token. The key to this is that those insects are green. So at any point, we can pay 2 mana, make a creature, and put a counter on Yorvo. Both of those things are going to be relevant for this deck. We have some cards that do care about +1/+1 counters. Getting Yorvo super big, giving him trample, also very good. And with things like Toski and Keeper of Fables, we want as many creatures on the board as possible. So combining these two just gives us multiple threats. We have a giant creature plus tons of little creatures. That's pretty hard for our opponents to deal with outside of a board wipe. And other than all the interactions, everything else going on, we come to the price point of this deck. Now, this deck was pretty expensive, $96.20. And honestly, a lot of that can be attributed to our commander, Questing Beast. He is $11.60, so pretty expensive. If you're looking to cut down on price, you could replace Questing Beast with another green legend, get it down to, $85. But the deck itself won't work quite as well without Questing Beast because you do want to be able to push through damage on your end and not your opponent's. So it would change the deck quite a bit, but it is possible. And what we're going to do now, the very last thing we're going to do, is we are going to jump into a game and see how this deck actually works in practice. So our opponents for today are going to be Dina Soulsteeper, which is played by my fiancée, Lena. We have Tevish Zot, Doom of Fools, played by Jason, and that is just Tevish Zot. He does not have a partner. And Extus Auric Overlord, which is played by Bilal, although, let's be perfectly honest, he's not playing Extus. He's playing Awaken the Blood Avatar. So, these three decks, I'm a little concerned looking at what's going to be sitting across the table from us. Dina doesn't need to deal combat damage to kill us with gaining life and losing life. Tevish Zot, probably a bit aristocrat style. They also probably don't need to do damage to us. And Awaken the Blood Avatar, while is probably going to have a ton of tokens and getting out the Blood Avatar super early, the fact that it can attack and do 3 damage to each opponent is going to be a little bit difficult to deal with. There's probably going to be some sacrifice triggers in there. So I am a little bit nervous sitting down to play this game, but hopefully we can get Questing Beast on board, keep him there, and then just kind of run through our opponents. So we'll see how it goes. I'll talk to you guys after the game, and I hope you guys enjoy it. At the start of the game, I get to go first, followed by Lena, then Jason, and then Bilal. On my first turn, I play a Forest, and then cast an Elvish Mystic. Lena plays a Forest, and then casts Soul Ring. Jason plays a Swamp. Bilal plays a Lava Claw Reaches. I play a Mosswort Bridge, hiding away a card. Lena plays a Sap Seep Forest, and then casts a Loxodon Warhammer. Jason casts a Soul Ring, plays a Swamp, and then casts a Bastion of Remembrance, making a human token, and making it so that anytime his creatures die, he gains a life, and each opponent loses a life. Bilal plays a Temple of Silence, scrying 1, and at the end of his turn, I cycle a Slippery Karst. On my turn, I play a Forest, cast Questing Beast, and then attack Jason for 4. Lena plays a Swamp, casts her commander, Dina Soulsteeper, making it so that whenever she gains life, each of her opponents loses a life. Jason plays a Swamp, Bilal plays a Mountain, and then casts Legion Warboss, before moving to combat and making a Goblin token. He then attacks Jason for 1 with the token, and Jason blocks with his human, but before the damage, he flashes in a Dictate of Erebos, forcing each of his opponents to sacrifice a creature whenever one of Jason's creatures dies. This kills off Elvish Mystic, Dina, and the Legion Warboss. On my turn, I play a Myriad Landscape and attack Lena for 4 with Questing Beast. Lena plays a Forest, and then casts an Ancient Craving, drawing 3 cards and losing 3 life. On Jason's turn, he casts Sengir Autocrat, making 3 Surf tokens. Bilal plays a Swamp, and then at the end of his turn, I cast Beast Within, destroying Dictate of Erebos and giving Jason a 3/3 Beast token. On my turn, I play a Forest, and then cast Toski, Bearer of Secrets, making it so I draw a card whenever my creatures do combat damage. I then attack Jason for 4 with Questing Beast, but he blocks with the Beast token and triggers his Bastion of Remembrance. Lena plays a Swamp, and then casts Verdant Sun's Avatar, gaining her life equal to the toughness of each creature she plays, including itself, so she gains 5 life. Jason plays a Swamp, and casts Plague Crafter, forcing each player to sacrifice a creature, killing Questing Beast, Verdant Sun's Avatar, and a Surf. Since Bilal has no creatures, he has to discard a card. However, to avoid discarding a card, Bilal casts Raise the Alarm, making 2 soldier tokens and sacrificing one of them instead. Jason then casts Yahenni Undying Partisan and attacks Lena for 2 with the Hasty Vampire. At the end of his turn, Bilal casts Thrill of Possibility, discarding a card and drawing 2, and then on his turn casts Siphon Mind, making each of his opponents discard a card and drawing 3. On my turn, I attack Lena for 1 with Toski, drawing a card, and in my second main phase, cast Grothama All Devouring. Lena plays a Witherbloom Campus and casts Pulse of Marasa, returning Verdant Sun's avatar to hand and gaining 6 life. Jason plays a Cabal Coffers and then casts his commander, Tevesh Zot, Doom of Fools. He then activates Tevesh Zot's +1 ability to sacrifice a Serf and draw 2 cards. Then casts an Orzhov Enforcer, and on Bilal's turn he casts Corpse Knight, which will drain his opponents for 1 every time a creature enters under his control. On my turn, I cast Elemental Bond, letting me draw a card whenever a creature with power 3 or greater enters under my control. I then activate Mosswarp Bridge, putting End Raise Forerunners into play. This pumps my team by +2/+2 and gives them all Trample and Vigilance. I also draw thanks to the Bond. I attack everything at Tevesh Zot, but on attacks, I have Toski and the Forerunners fight Grothama, killing everything but Toski and drawing 10 cards. Jason then blocks Toski with the Autocrat and a Serf. In my second main phase, I play a Forest and cast a Spore Frog. On Lena's turn, she casts Sanguine Bond, so whenever she gains life, target opponent loses that much life. Jason plays a Cabal Stronghold, and then casts Disciple of Bolas, sacrificing Plaguecrafter to draw 3 cards and gain 3 life. He then casts a Carrier Thrall, activates Tevesh Zot's +1 to sacrifice the Carrier Thrall, drawing 2 cards and making an Eldrazi Scion. He follows that up by casting Timuret, Chosen by Death. On Bilal's turn, he plays a Plains and casts a Maria Shepherd, making him a bird token whenever he plays a land. On my turn, we play a Forest, and then cast Ripjaw Raptor, drawing a card from Elemental Bond, before casting Garruk's Uprising, drawing a card when it enters thanks to Ripjaw Raptor having 4 power, and I move to combat, attacking Lena for 1 with Toski, drawing a card. Lena recast Verdant Sun's avatar, gaining 5 life, casts Vampire Nighthawk, gaining 3 more life. This does a total of 8 damage to Jason with Sanguine Bond, and at the end of turn, Jason activates Timuret to exile 2 creatures out of my graveyard and gains 2 life. He then moves to his turn, plays a Swamp, activates Tevesh Zot's +1 to sacrifice Disciple of Bolas and draw 2 cards, and he then casts Profane Command where X equals 4 to give Toski -4/-4, killing it and returning Sengir Autocrat to play. This makes 3 more Surf tokens. And he then casts a Blood Artist. This drains an opponent for 1 every time a creature dies. He follows that up with Pitiless Plunderer, which makes a treasure token whenever one of his creatures dies, and passes to Bilal. Bilal plays a Dragon Skull Summit, making a bird, and passes. On my turn, I play Ghost Quarter, immediately sacrificing it to destroy Jason's Cabal Coffers, recast Questing Beast, drawing 2 from my enchantments, and before combat, Bilal casts a Vanishing Verse to exile Yahenni. In response, Jason sacrifices 2 Serfs to Yahenni, triggering his Aristocrat effects. And Bilal then casts Dire Tactics to exile the Blood Artist. With that on the stack, Jason sacrifices the Eldrazi Scion, Sengir Autocrat, and the remaining Serf to Yahenni, pointing all the Blood Artist triggers at Bilal. The last thing to be sacrificed is the Blood Artist before the Vanishing Verse finally resolves, exiling Yahenni. With any blockers out of the way, I attack Jason with Questing Beast, dealing 4 to him and Tevesh Zot. On Lena's turn, she recasts Dina, gaining 3 life, doing 4 to Jason thanks to Sanguine Bond and Dina, and then casts Bloodthirsty Aerialist, which gets a +1/+1 counter every time she gains life, gains 3 more life, and does 4 more to Jason. Jason plays a Swamp, and then casts Attrition, allowing him to sacrifice creatures to destroy non-black creatures, and he activates Tevesh Zot's +2 ability to create 2 Thrall tokens. He then casts Victimize, sacrificing a Thrall to return Sengir Autocrat and Disciple of Bolas to play. This makes him 3 more Serfs, and he sacrifices Timuret to the Disciple, gaining 2 life, drawing 2 cards, before he casts a Spawning Pit. On Bilal's turn, he casts Authority of the Consuls, making it so all of his opponent's creatures enter tapped and gain him a life. On my turn, I play a Forest and cast Shamanic Revelation, drawing 3 cards and gaining 8 life. I then move to combat and attack Jason for 4, but before damage, he uses Attrition to sacrifice a Thrall and destroy Questing Beast. In my second main phase, I cast Kodama's Reach to put a forest to hand, and 1 to play. Lena plays a forest and then casts Sapling of Kolfanor, gaining 5 life, doing 6 to Jason, and putting a counter on the Aerialist, and then casts Guillaume, Master Chef, gaining 3 life, doing 4 to Jason, and putting another counter on the Aerialist, before moving to combat and attacking Tevesh Zot for 5, killing the Planeswalker. On Jason's turn, he plays a Swamp, and recasts his commander Tevesh Zot. He then activates Tevesh Zot's +1 ability, sacrificing a Thrall and drawing 2 cards, before casting Erebos Bleak-Hearted. This allows him to pay 2 life whenever his creatures die to draw a card. He then sacrifices a Thrall and Surf to the Spawning Pit. In response, Bilal casts Despark, exiling Erebos. In response to that, Jason activates Spawning Pit to make a spawn token, and then sacrifices that token as well, before casting Zot's Will, making each opponent sacrifice a creature with the greatest power, exiling all opponents' graveyards, and making 4 Thrall tokens. He then sacrifices all the Thralls to the Spawning Pit, and then activates Spawning Pit again, making 2 spawns, sacrifices those spawns to the Spawning Pit, activates the Spawning Pit again, making another spawn, and then Despark finally resolves, exiling Erebos. After all that, Jason casts Liliana, Heretical Healer, and then casts Viscera Seer. He then sacrifices Viscera Seer to Spawning Pit, transforming Liliana, Heretical Healer, into Liliana, Defiant Necromancer, before activating her +2 ability to make each player discard a card. On Bilal's turn, he plays a Mountain and casts Martial Coup, destroying all creatures and making 5 soldier tokens. In response, Jason sacrifices all of his creatures to the Spawning Pit, and then the board wipe resolves. On my turn, I play an Archetype of Endurance, giving my creatures hexproof and taking it away from my opponent's creatures, and drawing 2. I then play a Forest and cast Soul Guide Lantern, exiling Sengir Autocrat from Jason's graveyard. On Lena's turn, she plays a Rogue's Passage, casts Healing Technique, returning Verdant Sun's avatar to hand, gaining 7 life and doing 7 to Jason, before recasting her commander Dina. Jason casts Erebos, God of the Dead, stopping his opponents from gaining life, before playing a Crypt of Agadim, and then casting Sign in Blood, targeting himself to draw 2 cards and lose 2 life. He follows that up with Sir Conrad, which lets him do 1 damage to each opponent every time a creature goes in or out of the graveyard. In response to that, I sacrifice the Soul Guide Lantern to exile all of my opponent's graveyards. And Jason then casts a Falconwrath Noble, so whenever a creature dies, Jason can drain target opponent for 1. Then he activates Liliana's +2, making each player discard a card, and activates Tevesh Zot, making 2 Thralls. Bilal plays a Mountain on his turn, and then casts the back of his commander Awaken the Blood Avatar, making each opponent sacrifice a creature, and he then attacks Jason for 6, which kills me on attacks. Lena casts Tivash, Gloom Summoner, on her turn, and then Jason plays a Swamp, casts Zulaport Cutthroat, which makes it so that each of his creatures do a total of 4 damage to his opponents when they die, thanks to the Aristocrat triggers, allowing him to make a bunch of Thralls and spawns, sacrifice all of them, and winning the game. Alright, so that was a pretty fun game. We didn't get to do quite what we wanted. We honestly didn't cast a single fog effect, other than Spore Frog, but I don't know if that counts in this situation. And I was kind of right in my predictions that the aristocrat styles of Tevesh Zot and the life draining of Dina were a much bigger threat than what we could deal with. And honestly, Jason's Tevesh Zot just kind of took over the game. None of us could really do anything, and it became a massive threat early on that just spiraled out of control. So it was pretty sweet to see it go off, but definitely not a great matchup for our deck. But I hope you guys did enjoy the video. If you have any suggestions for future videos or future cards that you'd like to see turned into decks, please let me know. And I will see you all on the other side of the Dungeon Learner's Guide.